Let's go ahead and get started. So it's a little after 3:30, so we'll go ahead and get the show started up here. Welcome everyone to this second installment of the Arts and Humanities Community Lecture Series. My name is Professor Tucker, Kevin Tucker. I teach history here at University Park. I've been here since 2015 full time, and I started the lecture series as a way to kind of bring in scholarship from the community and from outside of either Lone Star or within Lone Star. And the idea behind this series is to bring to the Lone Star College community scholarship that's intended to enlighten, educate, and inform for the purpose of increasing civic awareness and promoting responsible citizenship. So these are two, I think, very important issues that we need more of these days. And I think that was quite clear back on January 6th, of course. We saw what can happen when these things aren't emphasized enough. And so my goal is to kind of help that a little bit. And I started this lecture series a couple years ago. So this is an ongoing twice per semester speaking invitation to either local university scholars as well as community college scholars, community leaders, and other special guests. So, and our guest today is Riley Sullivan. He is a graduate student at Sam Houston State University, go Bearcats, also where I got my graduate degree in history from as well. Riley was a former student here at Lone Star College, University Park. He worked with me with the Historical Society. He served as president for that organization for about 2 years, was it? It was about 2 years, I think.
Yeah, about 2 years.
Yes, and I got to know Riley really well during that time. He is an outstanding person. He's an incredible scholar, especially on the Civil War. Excuse me, the Civil War, which is his certainly his specialty, and he is incredibly knowledgeable about that event, and that will be the subject of his talk today. He's going to talk a little bit about some of the research he's done, and I'm very excited to have Riley today for this lecture. So, with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Riley. Riley, go ahead.
All right, thank you so much. Great, so we can get started. Let's see.
Absolutely.
All right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right, perfect. All right, hi everybody. As Professor Tucker just mentioned, I'm Riley Sullivan. I'm currently a graduate student at Sam Houston State University, where I'm getting, hopefully this semester I'll graduate with my MA thesis. And what I wanted to talk to you guys today about was actually a topic that I find very relevant, not only in the Civil War scholarship, but also within what we'll see in politics and our society today, which is the topic of Civil War memory. This is a topic that I've done a lot of research on for my thesis, and so a lot of this lecture is based off of much of what I've stated in my thesis and the research that I've gotten. So without any further ado, let's get started. So as the title said, it's a discussion in Civil War memory, and we're going to be focusing on the lost cause and the manipulation of the American mind. So to start off, I want to give an image that is very popular when individuals think of Civil War memory. What we see here is actually a veterans reunion at the Gettysburg battlefield in July of 1913. Once mortal enemies are now meeting as brothers in arms, clasping hands, and promoting this idea of reconciliation. This image is very popular, especially if many of you have seen the Ken Burns documentary series, The Civil War, where they promote this image of reconciliation as the memory of the Civil War. However, this memory is actually much more complicated, and that's what I wanted to discuss today and dive more into today. So that way we can have a greater understanding of what the memory of the Civil War was at this point in time, at the turn of the 20th century, and better understand it when we look at such things as Confederate monuments that are hot topics in political debates and as well as on the news today. So first off, what is Civil War memory? The definition that I provide, it is how Americans choose to remember the Civil War. Obviously, each generation, each individual, each group, they're going to remember the conflict in different ways. They're going to see it in a different light. And so one quote that I found throughout my research that many historians have often quoted in historical memory studies is from historian Robert Penn Warren, where he wrote, "The Civil War is for the American imagination the great single event of our history, and that it is our only felt history." He wrote this during the 1960s in the midst of the civil rights movement, and clearly he could see that the Civil War was all around him. They could see that the lasting legacies of the war were seemingly finally being met with the passage of the Civil Rights Acts. And so it's something that even resonates today. We do not fully see the legacies and the promises of the Civil War even to today. I also noted on here the memory of Reconstruction. When we talk about Civil War memory, it's also important to consider the memory of Reconstruction. Reconstruction is often overlooked by many individuals. However, Civil War memory really took shape during this period. So many of the memories that we're going to discuss today, they're going to basically form because of events that were occurring during Reconstruction. So what is the difference between history and memory? This is a topic that has even been complicated for me to answer. It's something that I've had to really do a lot of research into and read a lot of different articles to really understand the difference between memory and history. And so hopefully I provide a couple definitions that help us understand the differences between the two. So the first one, or the first definition I'll give is the definition of memory. It is how a group or an individual chooses to remember a particular event. So an example that I would give is, let's say you're trying to remember your career in college. Let's say you're a straight A student. Obviously, you would go around bragging to everybody saying that you made all A's. Now, let's say to get all those A's, you cheated on multiple exams, or you did something to manipulate your grade in that fashion. You're not going to go around telling everybody, oh, I cheated on every exam I ever took. You're going to lie and say, oh, I did all my hard work and I made all A's while I was in college. History, on the other hand, is evidence-supported arguments about the past that study how events have affected a group over a period of time. So essentially, historians are concerned with collecting facts from history and making arguments around the fact. So when analyzing someone's, say, college career that I just mentioned, they would say, oh, you have all A's. However, we also have records that you plagiarized on some of these tests, or you plagiarized on some of these papers. So they would take this into consideration, and they would form an argument that encompasses all the historical facts surrounding that period of time. Now, with the two definitions, let's dive into, there were several different types of Civil War memory. The most prominent memory that we'll discuss throughout this lecture is the white supremacist or the lost cause memory of the war. I'll give a few more details of the main arguments in a later slide, but essentially the basic argument of the lost cause was promoted by white Southerners in order to promote a white supremacist society. Then you have the Unionist memory of the war. It was predominant amongst Northern Union veterans as well as some of the Northern public, and it argued against the lost cause and argued that the war was for a reunion and that they wanted to punish the slaveholders who had caused the Civil War. However, even though they're trying to punish the slaveholders and the old aristocratic class of the Old South, they weren't necessarily pro-equality. So some of them would have white supremacist ideology and rhetoric, but it did not mean that they subscribed to the lost cause. Then you have an emancipationist memory of the war. This was adopted by the African American community as well as some Northern veterans, in which they argued that the lasting legacy of the war was emancipation, that the war had been fought to end slavery and to bring about equality. And as we'll see, many of those arguments they make and those legacies they believe the war was over went unfulfilled for over 100 years, and in some ways still haven't been fulfilled to this day. And lastly, we have the reconciliationist memory of the war, which historians have identified with mostly the Northern public as well as the South, and they adopt this idea that they want reconciliation more than anything else. They wanted the Civil War to be forgotten, and they wanted to adopt ideas of reunion at the expense of racial justice. And so all these memories began to fester during the war. However, for the sake of this lecture, I would like to point to Appomattox and start there. So as we all know, at Appomattox, General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant on April 9, 1865. Many historians have recognized this as the end of open warfare for the American Civil War, and therefore the collapse of the Confederacy. or the total collapse of the Confederacy, I should add. And so with this, many of the soldiers that were in the army, or in both armies at this event, realized that there's going to be a post-war world that was going to be something they wanted to shape in their image. So for white Northern veterans, they wanted to, as I mentioned before, punish the slaveholders. They wanted to shape the Southern society in a Northern mold to bring in free labor. However, this did not mean that they subscribed to ideas of equality. Then you had African American troops that also served in the armies around Appomattox. They left the battlefield thinking that the post-war world would include ideas of equality and that society would truly become the truly democratic society that was promised in the Constitution. And then lastly, in the subject of this lecture, you have the white Southern veterans who leave Appomattox thinking that the post-war world would return to the status quo before the Civil War and reinaugurate slavery. They believe that the ratification of the 13th Amendment would fall apart and that slavery would be once again instituted. However, as we know from looking at the history books, slavery was never reinstituted and they returned to a completely different society. And so what is the Lost Cause? The Lost Cause is a Southern white supremacist memory of the war that has several arguments. However, I've listed 4 of the major arguments that we would see today. Perhaps one of the most popular arguments that we still see in literature today is that slavery was not the cause of the war, but rather states' rights. However, this is quickly debunked when we look at the rhetoric that many of the Confederate officials used at the beginning of the war, where they argued that slavery was the cornerstone of the Confederacy and that without it, white civilization could not flourish. However, they wanted to try to hide these arguments and try to promote the idea of states' rights in order to promote the image that they had not seceded because they were this radical group, that this slaveholding class that ruled over the South, this oligarchy. So they started to make these arguments. And this is an argument we'll see in much of the literature even today that public historians are even making. We also see arguments that the Southern soldiers fought honorably and nobly. This is a very popular argument, and they believed, Lost Causers believed that Southern soldiers did not commit acts of atrocity, that they didn't do anything wrong during the war, and that because of their actions they were fighting honorably and nobly, they must have been fighting for an honorable and noble cause. However, we can debunk this claim when we look at such events as prisoner of war camps at Andersonville, Georgia, where you see atrocities committed against the prisoners there, or the Union prisoners there, which we'll see later. We also have the argument that overwhelming resources and manpower won the war for the North. This is still a popular argument within the Lost Cause literature today, where individuals argue that Grant had just thrown troops at Lee and that only through sheer willpower of, or sheer numbers, I should say, of the Union forces that the Confederacy eventually capitulated. However, this ignores the fact that the Confederate government began to collapse within itself with the numerous military campaigns and also what was occurring within the South during the latter years of the war. And then lastly, they also condemned the idea of emancipation and the abolition of slavery. Now, a lot of this comes through what we'll see through the rhetoric of during the Reconstruction period, during the early phases of the shaping of the Lost Cause. And they would argue that slavery was actually this good institution rather than this institution that had been depicted by individuals such as Harry Beecher Stowe in Uncle Tom's Cabin, where it was depicted with cruel images and what it truly was actually like. So the origins of the Lost Cause can be traced to during the war. However, many historians like to credit the name of the movement to a book that came out after the war. So the first real mention of the Lost Cause was in 1867 by a Southern journalist named Edward A. Bullard. He wrote a book called The Lost Cause, which eventually is what the movement got its name from. And so his rhetoric would come to shape how Southerners chose to remember the war long after he published the book and well into the 20th century. And so I've included an excerpt from The Lost Cause to kind of gauge and see what kind of rhetoric was used in these works to make the arguments that Southerners wanted to in order to advance white supremacist ideology. And so the excerpt reads, "We shall not enter upon the discussion of the moral question of slavery, but we may suggest a doubt here whether that obvious term, slavery, which has been so long imposed by the exaggeration of Northern writers upon the judgments and sympathies of the world, is properly applied to that system of servitude in the South, which was really the mildest in the world, which did not rest on acts of debasement and disenfranchisement, but elevated the African and was in the interest of human improvement, and which by the law of the land protected the Negro in life and limb, and in many personal rights, and by the practice of the system bestowed upon him a sum of individual indulgences, which made him altogether the most striking type in the world of cheerfulness and contentment." As we can see, there's a lot of information to digest just from this one excerpt from The Lost Cause. However, what's most obvious that we would point out is that Pollard is trying to make the argument that slavery was not as bad as what Harriet Beecher Stowe had written in Uncle Tom's Cabin, but rather it was the mildest system in the world. And he even argues that under this institution, African Americans were seeing the most progress they could as a race. And this is an argument that becomes especially popular throughout the Lost Cause, leading into the 20th century, and is consistently revisited by later writers. Now, Pollard established many of the early arguments of the Lost Cause. However, he did not popularize the Lost Cause. It did not rise considerably under his works. It wasn't until the 1870s and the 1880s that Southerners began to really take interest into the Lost Cause as they fought back against the policies of Reconstruction. One of the earliest individuals to make many of the arguments of the Lost Cause was former Confederate General Jubal Early. He established much of the early literature of the movement, where he made the argument that the North had only won the war by overwhelming resources, and where he ignored the internal collapse of the Confederate government. He promoted white Southern unity by accepting ideas saying that the Confederate soldier had fought honorably and nobly. And under all this, he promoted a white supremacist ideology to justify what they were doing with the Jim Crow laws and then the post-Reconstruction period. He based much of his evidence off of letters that he had with Robert E. Lee immediately after the war, as well as the farewell address that Robert E. Lee gave to his soldiers at Appomattox. And in this is where Lee made many of the arguments that Jubal Early made, where he said that only through overwhelming resources did you guys capitulate. You guys had fought with courage and honor for a noble cause. And so he takes these as his own cause and promotes them, and it becomes very popular. However, he does not really subscribe into reconciliation with his Northern allies and is what we would call an unreconstructed rebel and would never essentially return to the Union in his eyes. However, for the Lost Cause to continue to develop, it was necessary that they take on this reconciliationist tone. And so you didn't really see this until the 1880s and the 1890s when a group known as the United Daughters of the Confederacy started to take shape. It's perhaps the most important group involved in the shaping of collective memory for the war, for the South, and they did so through a variety of means. We'll see here in a minute how they did it through monuments and statues, but they took to the textbooks. They would write in textbooks racial rhetoric that promoted the ideas of slavery and white supremacy, as well as promoting many of the arguments of the Lost Cause. And in many ways, some historians have written that if you look at history books during this period, it was almost history of the South and of the Lost Cause. And that Southern history was the only history that mattered to them. So I want to digress a little bit from the topic of the Lost Cause, and I want to go into Confederate monuments. Obviously, this is a hotly discussed topic within both the political sphere as well as amongst individuals today. And it's what to do with these monuments. Should we remove them? Should we keep them? Should we relocate them? And so before we enter any discussion of or any argument of this, I think it's better that we understand exactly what these monuments are and what they represent. And so to do this, I've included some Confederate monuments that would be something we could see and that's very visible to us here in Texas. And so many of these dedicated by the UDC, and many of them dotted the region in the South and also of Texas. Now, it's been argued by historians that Texas did not see a very large acceptance of the lost cause because they were more focused on the issues of the Texas Revolution and the memory of that period. However, contemporary historians have debunked this idea as they've looked at Confederate monuments and see that they dot the landscape of Texas. So these are only a few that I have. I believe there's 160 or so Confederate monuments, names of buildings throughout Texas. But anyway, starting with these three, they were depicted in a number of styles. So this Confederate monument that I have depicted here on the screen is from Marshall, Texas, and it was dedicated in 1906, as I mentioned, by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Now, it is of the average Confederate soldier in many small towns, as well as larger cities as well, dedicated monuments to soldiers that had fought during the war. They would promote the idea that they had fought honorably and nobly, and they wanted to use this through the memorialization of them. Another example of a Confederate monument depicting the Confederate soldier is in Gonzales, Texas, in what is Confederate Square. It was dedicated by the UDC in 1909. And what's interesting about this one, as well as a few others in the region, is they have an inscription on it. Least we forget. Least we forget what? Least we forget the Confederate cause. Least we forget the Old South. Least we forget how these soldiers fought honorably and nobly. There's much rhetoric that they used at these to justify what they had come from. And it was through a white supremacist ideology that they wrote these words, least we forget. Because once again, as I alluded to earlier, they believed that society in the South before the Civil War was at its most perfect, that democracy was at its purest form, as one writer wrote. And so many of the speeches that were given at these monuments would talk about these issues, and they would not make it, they would not try to hide that race was a central issue to many of them. They would always argue and say that slavery was a better institution and that African Americans were better in this institution. And it would just have this racially charged rhetoric. And several speeches would be given at these dedications. And if I'm not mistaken, at Gonzales, Texas, there was about 4,000 individuals that showed up for the dedication of this monument. Then we also have monuments that we're probably more familiar with through the news, which are of Confederate high officials. Now, I have depicted here a Confederate monument in Dallas, Texas. It was dedicated in 1897, once again by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. However, it's been since removed during the summer of 2020. However, it's relevant to what we see because we often think of Confederate monuments when we think of Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson. So these individuals are depicted here in Texas, which is interesting because they served in the Eastern Theater. So depicted on the statue are the individuals Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who we're all familiar with. However, there's one individual that we may not be so familiar with because he served in the Western Theater. However, for Texans at the time, he would have been a very instrumental figure when promoting lost cause. This individual would have been Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston, who I have displayed closer up on the right. And he was, as I mentioned, he was a Confederate general that served in the Western Theater. However, he had close ties with Texas. He was born a Kentuckian. However, with the outbreak of the Texas Revolution, he came to serve in the Texian Army. Serving in the Texian Army throughout the Republic of Texas period, he would later re-enlist in the United States Army when Texas was annexed in 1845 and served in the Mexican War. However, he was one of the most highly regarded federal officers at the outbreak of the Civil War, and he would find himself with the Western Theater Post. Obviously, this would make more sense for him as he was a Kentuckian by birth as well as a Texan. This would make the most sense. And since he was placed here, not a lot of emphasis from the lost cause has been placed on him except for within communities that had served in the Western Theater. And so in the Western Theater, he had retreated from Kentucky, had abandoned Nashville and Western Tennessee, and died on the field of battle at Shiloh on April 6, 1862. However, he's very central to the myth of the lost cause and its iconography because at Shiloh, a myth develops around him. Since he died on the first day when the Confederates were attacking and seemingly had success, many individuals questioned whether or not, had he lived, if the Confederates would have won the day, destroyed General Grant's army, and turned the tide in the Western Theater and possibly win the war. And so this myth, known as the lost opportunity thesis, it begins to develop amongst veterans who served in the Western Theater. And it becomes a very popular myth amongst them. However, in the overall lost cause scholarship that we see today, we do not see this myth very often because many individuals focus on the Eastern Theater. And so this is something I found interesting in my research, because while I was researching on Tennessee troops, there's a similar pattern. They lionize this individual because most of them had served in the Western Theater. And so this is an interesting aspect of the lost cause, I think, that historians should take note, because they've not fully examined how the lost cause took shape in different regions of the United States, whether it was in Texas, Tennessee, or Virginia. It had its own different mold and how individuals viewed that event. However, returning to the original topic of Confederate monuments in Texas, these monuments dotted the whole region, and it demonstrated how the lost cause had dominated the memory of Texas and also the memory of the South, and how it was becoming widely accepted by individuals both North and South, because there was also Confederate statues that dot the North. And so with all these statues, historians have developed this thought process that the Confederates had lost the war but won the South, which is just especially true, as we just saw. Another way we could see this is that Jim Crow was the lasting legacy of the victory the South won through the memory of the war, because they were able to bring their white supremacist ideology and apply it to politics in order to create a society as close as they could to a pre-war antebellum society. And so by the turn of the century, the lost cause had become the most popular method of war, not just in the South, but also in the North, because a reconciliationist memory in the North accepted many of the myths and legends of the lost cause just because they wanted to achieve sectional reconciliation and to forget all the battles that were fought during the war. However, I want to note here, it's important to know that many of the Union veterans who had fought during the war did not subscribe to a reconciliationist memory, but rather rebucked the ideology of the lost cause and the memory of that movement. However, by the turn of the century, the lost cause is gaining traction amongst the American public, and it's really becoming popular through different mediums. Thomas Dixon Jr. published a novel in 1905 titled The Klansman, A Historical Romance of the Ku Klux Klan. Historian Henry Louis Gates described it as the White South's version of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so it gains a very wide audience and is very well accepted. It eventually turns into a play and later is adapted into a motion picture. E.W. Griffith's film The Birth of the Nation is based off of it, where he's in close consultation with Thomas Dixon Jr. And so the film showed a white supremacist memory of the war and Reconstruction by making the argument that African Americans were better off in slavery. Now, the film is divided into two parts, and where it makes many of the arguments that we've already seen is in each of these parts. You can see it throughout the film. It's about a 3-hour film. And in the first part, the film is focusing on the antebellum period, which they project as this pure and this harmonious period that everybody was happy with and that nobody wanted to end. However, along came the Civil War, and then you see the honorable and noble Confederate soldier fighting in combat. Now, they also promote reconciliationist tones at this point, where they promote the honorable and noble Northern veterans. However, in the second part, they turn to Reconstruction, a period that they saw as a failure, but not in the ways that we would today. They saw it as a failure because they saw that it attempted to uproot their society in a bad way. They believed that African Americans were an unruly society, and that outside of slavery, they would commit acts of violence and pillage and rape women and all these insane arguments, and that they argued that they were really adult children. And so the second part begins with an African American legislature in, I believe it's South Carolina, convening, where they're promoting ideas of equality, something that we would all accept, where they're promoting the idea that African Americans should have the right to vote and that they should have proper representation and that they should be allowed to marry whoever they want. However, the white individuals who are seeing this legislation are looking on in disgust and in fear. And so out of this, they form their own secret society, the Ku Klux Klan, which at the end of the film come riding in heroically to save the day and to restore order to the South and what they saw as an unruly branch of government. And so, as we can see, it shows the sad state of Civil War memory during this period, because this film was critically acclaimed and was widely accepted by many audiences. And it even had box office records that lasted for, I believe, 20 years. That lasted well into the 1930s. And so you can really see how the Lost Cause began to take hold of the American mind. And so we return to the original image, and we have, as we have seen, a more complicated picture of Civil War memory. It's not of Reconstruction, but there's a white supremacist ideology that is being promoted, where it has counter-narratives that it's trying to shut down and end. However, what we can see most prevalent with the Lost Cause is at this image, when Woodrow Wilson, who was a Southerner from Virginia and a Lost Cause writer, gave a speech about what those 50 years had meant since the war and reflecting on what his belief was the state of Civil War memory at that time. So he quoted, "But 50 years have gone by since then, and I crave the privilege of speaking to you for a few minutes of what those 50 years have meant. What have they meant? They have meant peace and union and vigor and the maturity and might of a great nation. How wholesome and healing the peace has been. We have found one another again as brothers and comrades in arms, enemies no longer, generous friends rather, our battles long past, the quarrel forgotten, except that we shall not forget the splendid valor, the manly devotion of the men then arrayed against one another, now grasping hands and smiling in each other's eyes." Now, obviously, we can see very quickly off, he's promoting ideas of reconciliation. Perhaps the most quoted verse in this speech is, "The quarrel forgotten and our battles long past." However, what's interesting about this part of the speech is what he says at the beginning. "But 50 years have gone by since then. What have they meant? They have meant peace and union and vigor and the maturity and might of a great nation." Here he's making arguments from the Lost Cause. He's promoting the idea that through the Jim Crow South, the nation is progressing and that white Western civilization is reaching its zenith and that it's at its best. And he's using reconciliationist tones to help promote this argument. Now, it's easy to see how the Lost Cause has taken over much of the South, and it's easy for us to identify the Lost Cause as the only memory in the South. However, through the course of my research, I found this is not the case, as many Southerners did not outright subscribe to the Lost Cause ideology, and therefore they present a counter-narrative to the Lost Cause myth, and they also show the loose foundations that the Lost Cause was founded upon. The Lost Cause was founded upon this idea of white Southern unity, where they hoped that every white Southerner would adopt a Confederate identity as their own. However, individuals that accepted the memory known as Southern Unionism show that this is a very loose foundation and show that this is especially not true. So it's important for us to recognize that over 300,000 Southerners served in the Union Army during the Civil War. A good portion of Southerners who helped, in many historians have argued, turn the tide of the war. Now, it is true that some of them have adopted a Confederate identity and have accepted the Lost Cause because of the abolition of slavery. The reason for this is they felt betrayed by the Union cause because they thought they were only fighting to restore the Union and to bring in the slaveholders that they believed had caused the war. However, they did not make up all the Southern Unionists. There were also Southern Unionists who developed a memory of the war where they did not accept the Lost Cause and accepted different ideas that were different than its Northern Unionist counterpart. So Southern Unionism, through my research, I found is a very complicated topic, and the individual experience is varied. Largely, the reason we can't put a definition on Southern Unionism to singularly define it is because it never gained a real strong collective following. It really differed from region to region. You could maybe make the argument in a certain region, such as East Tennessee, but it's very difficult to do that. And so I found it easier to define Southern Unionism as unique to the individual. And so some Southern Unionists followed the Northern path, where they promoted the idea that they had fought for a reunion and that they wanted to punish the slaveholders. However, they were not in the same light. They were not honed to accept ideas of equality after them. There's also aspects of Southern Unionism where they couldn't accept a lost cause memory of the war because they had been prisoners of war or victims of guerrilla actions during the conflict. And this made them different from their Southern counterparts, and they did not want to forget atrocities that were committed against them. And then lastly, you have the outliers that were the emancipationists in this memory of the war, that were Republicans, that were Southern white Republicans that had served in Congress after the war, that had argued for ideas of equality. Now, some of their ideas cooled over time as the Jim Crow South began to really solidify. However, they serve as another complication to the lost cause narrative. And so this is one of the most interesting things that I found in my research, was the discussion of Southern Unionism, because it's a topic that Civil War historians of historical memory often overlook, and it's a dynamic they should consider when making their arguments of the lost cause and understanding why the lost cause did not take shape in certain regions when it did, and how it shaped in certain ways in one region versus another. So I'm going to end my lecture today with some sources and further readings that I've used to help construct both my research as well as my lecture. A couple that I would like to highlight. I'd like to highlight, if you're interested in further looking at the issue of Civil War memory, I would definitely start with David Wright's Race and Reunion. That's the cornerstone piece of Civil War memory studies today, and almost any memory study will mention him. I'd also like to point out Carolyn E. Janning's Remembering the Civil War. It serves as almost a counter argument to some of the arguments that Blight made, and demonstrates how Union veterans did not necessarily accept the ideas of reconciliation and how there were limits to it. And then lastly, I'd like to point out my own professors, Dr. Brian Matthew Jordan's Marching Home, which also talks about Union veterans and demonstrates how they would not forget the war and how they would not subscribe to a lost cause memory of the war and would not allow it to win, even if the American public was attempting to allow it through reconciliation. I hope you all enjoyed my lecture. I certainly enjoyed giving it to you guys. This is a topic that I think is especially relevant, and it's something that we should all consider whenever we discuss topics of Confederate monuments or anything related to the American Civil War. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. I'll try to answer them the best way I can. But other than that, I just want to thank everybody once again for listening in.
Thank you very much, Riley. That was fantastic. And absolutely, if anyone has any questions, please just put them in the chat window, or I think Tabitha can activate you and make you able to speak as well. So, any questions right now? If not, I can start with one. So, Riley, I did want to discuss one thing that I thought was interesting in your presentation. If you go back to that photograph showing the reunion, right? And I couldn't help but notice that on one side you have the old, the veterans, the Southern veterans wearing their uniforms, whereas on the other side they look like the Union veterans. They were primarily wearing what we consider, normal civilian clothing. Do you think there's some significance there, that one side was still kind of, feeling that past, and the other side had sort of moved on, or what is your take on that?
So many individuals that it's kind of hard take because even whenever I was going through the lecture beforehand, I was kind of analyzing parts of it. And one thing that's interesting to me is obviously we look at it and we see this image of reconciliation. And through it, I made the argument that Union veterans didn't accept this idea. And so as you see in the image, it appears they did. And so I'm a little skeptical of the individuals that were involved, if they maybe accepted reconciliation and maybe did not have this, pride in the cause they had fought for. So it's an image you should always take skeptically, because it doesn't paint the whole picture, as we saw throughout the lecture, of what Civil War memory was and where the state was. Because if you look actually at Gettysburg during that period in the summer of 1913, when all the veterans were there was actually a newspaper I included in my thesis, where Union veterans and Southern veterans had a bar fight, and there's a knife stabbing all involved in a thing, and it showed that the Civil War hadn't truly ended. So some of these images I would definitely take skeptically. And then there's also other images of reconciliation I've seen where Union veterans are in their full uniform with Confederate veterans in their full uniform. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it was around the time of the Spanish-American War, because they promoted that idea at that time as well.
Yeah. Okay, good point. You got to kind of you got to sort of be careful with photographic evidence, because you kind of need to know the context, and there's just a lot of limitations on how far you can go with it, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I did think that was curious. Good. Does anybody have any questions for Riley?
Don't be shy.
Exactly. Please jump in. This is a discussion. What would you say, Riley, to people today who, when they see monuments, the Confederate monuments, or even the Confederate flag, and they say, hey, this is Southern heritage. I'm honoring my ancestors, right? This is history. That's all it is. In other words, they may not even be aware of where that's coming from. What would you say to that? How would you respond to that sort of defense?
The first thing I would do is I would ask them and analyze their memory of the conflict. What does it mean to them? How does it shape? Where do they get their beliefs from? Did they read this book or that book? Where do they get it from? And then I would point out some other evidence that would be interesting for them to analyze, such as what I've mentioned throughout this, of the racial rhetoric that was used at the dedication of these monuments, the cornerstone of the South being slavery, and have them analyze those and see if they still believe that, or how it shaped their memory at that point.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand there is a difference between history and memory. And even in some ways, I was thinking about this too. You often hear that you hear people say, or I've heard it said, that history is written by winners, or the winners. And what's interesting about this is, in a sense, that's not true. This sort of debunks that. Because in this case, the losing side ended up having the dominant narrative explanation for what happened. And so that is a little bit interesting in that regard. Do you think, Riley, that the lost cause myth has, it's changed today? We don't even really call it the lost cause myth in terms of, how people think about the Civil War today. What do you think has changed in our remembrance of the Civil War today?
It's the lost cause, I would say, is still present today, but it's adopted to what social norms are. Obviously, there wouldn't be as open a white supremacist rhetoric if they have one, and they've adopted more of the arguments that I alluded to of slavery wasn't the cause of the war, states' rights was. There's even a book, I forget who it's by, but I see it often, all the time, and it's titled "The South Was Right." And so there's still that lost cause present in today's society, but it's just taken a different mold with social norms. And you'll see even with the lost cause over time, if you were to analyze it into the 1940s and into the 1960s, it takes on that similar kind of viewpoint.
Yeah, good.
Let's see, we have a question in the chat. Let's see, did the Republicans stop trying in the South? It seems it was largely a party for abolitionists, but do politicians inevitably reflect their constituents regardless of party? It seems it's happening with both parties today. So the Republican Party wasn't a universally abolitionist party. I think it's something we should recognize, is that about, I believe in the figures, 2% of the northern population was abolitionist. And so many of the Republicans in Congress were not necessarily radical Republicans. And so whenever the Democrats started to come around in the 1870s, many of these moderate Republicans started to jump ship and not support the ideas of Reconstruction. There's many arguments. I'm actually taking a course right now in Reconstruction, and there's a variety of arguments of why Reconstruction lost its edge and why moderate Republicans eventually did not back these policies. But it all kind of reverts back to the idea of ending the war and ending some of this conflict that they were seeing, even if it was at the expense of racial justice.
Good. Yeah, it looks like we have somebody, Mariah Garcia, asking if you've been to any of the monuments.
That's actually interesting. I thought of it. I went to San Antonio in September, or not September, in January. And I knew I was doing this presentation, and I knew I was going to include some of these Texas monuments. And the one I pointed out, Gonzales, that was a monument I considered visiting. I haven't visited any in Texas or any, on the side of the road if you're driving through anywhere. I've been to the battlefields and seen them, and their inscriptions are very similar. They would have had dedication ceremonies just like it with members of that regiment or individuals for that family or whatever the case is for that spot. So I haven't been to ones in Texas.
Okay. And it looks like we have someone went to San Jacinto. And then we have a question from Ruth. Can you speak a little more about the antebellum period? What do you, I guess, I'm not sure what you mean, Ruth. Maybe you can give us more specifics, or would you like to talk a little bit more, Riley, on that?
So I'll just address the antebellum period. So a lot of writers in the Lost Cause have often referred to the antebellum period as essentially what they saw as the height of white Western civilization. They believed slavery was necessary for civilization to progress, and they would often look back on this period with this idea that this was the purest form of democracy, as one of the individuals that I've written about quotes it. And so the antebellum period played a large role also in shaping the post-war mind and the memory of the war, because they were trying to recreate a society and recreate the structure of where the slaveholders, who are no longer slaveholders, were still at the top of society, and to recreate this oligarchy. It's actually a book we just got finished reading. It's called Reconstructing Democracy. And it's about the African-American experience in politics in the Natchez region of Mississippi and Louisiana. And it discussed how they developed a biracial government that had different political ideas, that there were not just Republican African-Americans, there was also Democratic African-Americans, and that some of the poorer whites participated in this government. But what he also argues is that a white slaveholding oligarchy that was present before the war, which would be the slaveholders, were trying to retake over the government in the region, which they eventually do through racial violence. And they institute the laws of Jim Crow to essentially restate the pre-war racial social order, where they were on top, followed by poor whites, and then African Americans at the bottom. And they did this to the idea of white Southern Union.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point to make about what the South was like prior to the Civil War. It was very much a very strict hierarchy, almost sort of an aristocracy, if you will.
Mhm.
And yet it was viewed, by people afterwards as sort of the perfect society. Everybody
Mhm.
sort of in their quote unquote natural spot. And so it's interesting to see, because another question I was thinking about is trying to explain how this caught on so well in the North, or why the North was able to, allow this myth to take foot. And I mean, you can understand why it happened in the South.
Mhm.
That makes sense. But what do you think it was about it in the North that allowed it to catch on? Was it the inherent racism involved, or was it just simple lack of desire to challenge the
Mhm.
myth? What do you think
Yeah,
best explains it?
it's exactly those reasons. So you would have, there was, especially in the Northwest, I believe, the there was widespread racism in that region. And so individuals were more susceptible to accept the lost cause because it didn't differ much from some of their beliefs, and they wouldn't see Jim Crow as something bad to them. And then also the prevailing reconciliationist memory. Many members of the northern populace wanted to move on from the war. They wanted to bring the country back together, and so they saw that these were kind of common ground that they could meet on, and that way they could achieve reconciliation and reunion of the nation as quickly as possible.
And I think it's important. Another point to make on this, why I think this is so fascinating, is that this lost cause myth, it's a specific thing to America. However, we see these kinds of things throughout history all the time.
Mhm.
We see these ideas develop around explaining what happened in the past that doesn't really match the facts. I think one famous example was after World War One and what happened in Germany. They sort of had their version of a lost cause.
Yeah.
And we sort of saw where that led. And so I think it's important, for us to understand that these things have great power and can have a great power in society. And I've even heard talk lately. This is interesting because I'm an historian. My ears perk up. But after what happened in January 6th and all the election fraud claims that were made, I started hearing the word "lost cause" being flown around again. This is
Mhm.
the Trump lost cause myth, if you will. What do you think about that? Do you think that's an accurate? Is that fair to use that term?
Um, I mean, it'll probably develop. I could see developing another term because it would have too close of a relationship with the Civil War. But I could definitely see something similar develop out of uh, instances like that.
Mhm.
Even I wanted to elaborate more because you pointed out World War One, there was a similar instance. Even in World War Two, I actually wrote a research paper over it. It's called the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, which has many of the same arguments of the lost cause or what they're trying to do. Now, I want to tread lightly there because my professor said don't exactly say they're the same thing, but they have very similar attitudes, and you can see how
Right.
societies take on those tones.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the point. The lost cause was specific to the American Civil War. However, there are patterns that we see in other places as well that develop, kind of, the way to explain the
Mhm.
past and make it a usable for society, right? And make that usable past that historians like to talk about so much.
Yeah.
But good. Does anybody have any other questions? Anyone want to ask Riley a question?
Hope I didn't miss any.
Tabitha, do we have any in the chat?
No, I've
Okay.
done whatever's come through.
Okay. Yeah, I figured you did. Okay. All right. Well, if not, then I guess we'll go ahead and conclude the program. Once again, I'd like to thank all of you for attending today. I want to thank Tabitha for helping put all this together and doing all the behind the scenes logistics and things. And I of course, want to thank Riley Sullivan for his talk today. It was fantastic. It was enlightening. It's very, I think, relevant to what's happening today. And it shows you the power of history and how important it is to society and how it can change over time and how it can really, you know, alter, if you will, our view of the past, whether for good or for ill. And so, thank you again, Riley. Any final comments,
I
Riley?
just want to thank all of you for attending, and thank Lone Star College and the wonderful faculty and staff there for always giving me an opportunity to speak. I always enjoy doing it every time.
Anytime, Riley. You're always welcome. You're always going to be family. UP family. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. We'll go and conclude the program. And have a great afternoon, everybody. And for all my students who attended, thank you very much. And for all those watching in the future on the recording, I thank you for watching as well. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.